Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Candice. Today we are talking about worldly peace, like the inner peace that people tout all the time, versus godly peace. And we're going to talk about the differences and which one's better and how to achieve it and all that jazz. We're going to pray first and then we're going to dive right in. God, thank you so much for having an abundance of peace that you give to us freely if we want it. Thank you for giving us free will and giving us the choice of whether or not to be with you, whether or not to follow you, for giving us a choice of whether or not we want to be stressed out or we want to have your peace. I ask that you would bless every single person listening to this video and that you would touch them with something you want them to hear. That this would be your video, not mine, your words, not mine. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's name. Alright, so in the world, right, you'll see all of these things about, finding inner peace, right? Finding it as though somehow it were like a dog that was chained up in the backyard and like you kept it for a while, but then it keeps escaping and running away, and then you have to go find it because now it's lost and you have to like bring it back, but then it escapes again, the moment it feels like it. This kind of peace tends to happen like if you go to a retreat, or if you go on a vacation, or if you go sit on a mountaintop and meditate while looking at very peaceful scenery, right? This is the kind of peace that is usually tied to like a location or an activity, or it's tied to circumstances going really well in your life, right? But this kind of peace, the moment it's confronted with day-to-day stress, when it's confronted with day-to-day circumstances that are not the greatest, or things happen that might make you worried or anxious or whatever else, then that peace just disappears, right? And then you're supposed to go find it again, right? The world offers peace, but that peace is only connected to when circumstances are going really well, right? The moment circumstances get hard, the world isn't offering you peace anymore. It's offering you stress and doubt and depression and anxiety and, anti-anxiety meds and all of that sort of stuff. When adversity comes, the worldly peace skedaddles and is gone, right? Now, the difference between that, of course, and godly peace is when you have God in your life, when you've accepted God, you've accepted Jesus, you've been baptized and all that, you have the Holy Spirit living inside of you. And that means you have access to peace anytime you want it. It doesn't just run away, right? It doesn't disappear the moment circumstances get hard. It's always right here. And all you have to do is be willing to accept it, right? All you have to do is to be willing to let it in and to put your stresses and your worries down, right? And just ask God to give you that peace. And He will give you this peace that transcends everything, right? Peace that even if your circumstances are horrible, right, you'll still have this inner peace that is completely unexplainable to everybody else. Everybody else looks like you're crazy. How can you still have peace, when you're going through this and this and this and that, It's an inner peace that is completely different than what the world offers, because it's there no matter what, right? So long as you want it, right? You can always choose to, even as a Christian, you can always choose to focus on stressing and worrying and having anxiety and trying to fix circumstances yourself, should you choose to do so. We have free will, right? But there's also the option to let those things go and to have that peace even in the worst of circumstances, right? If you look in the Bible, right, there's a lot of examples of this. One that I was looking at recently was Joseph, okay? And for those of you who don't know, Joseph was born into a family. He had a lot of brothers, right, who were older than him. He was one of the youngest. And he had this dream from God that his older brothers were going to bow down to him one day, right? His older brothers, of course, thought he was crazy. And they were like mad because their father liked him better than them because they were doing some crazy stuff. And so they decided to sell him into slavery. and then tell their father that he died, right? So Joseph got dragged off to be a slave in Egypt, which was not his country, right? Not his place. And he was a slave. He had to go work for somebody else, probably was beaten, as things tend to happen that way. And then, he's doing okay as a slave, right? He's still faithful to God. He's still trusting in God. And, he is having a better position as a slave, but he's still a slave. Eventually, he gets accused of a crime he didn't even commit. And he ends up in prison, which is there's slave, which is kind of low on the status poll, right? But then you got prisoner, which is another level of not so great circumstances, right? And he's a prisoner and a slave for years of his life, right? Years. These are the kind of circumstances where worldly peace would have completely disappeared and you wouldn't be able to find it anywhere, right? But he still trusts God. He chooses to trust God. He chooses to believe that, God is going to figure it out, that God is going to turn his circumstances around at some point, and that God is going to do what he promised through that dream, right? And these are the kind of circumstances, right, where it would only be natural, right, to stop believing, to think, well, maybe that dream wasn't really what I thought it was, or to just not have faith in God, right? To be my circumstances are so bad, and they went from bad to even worse. What's going on, God? Why am I here? This doesn't make any sense. But ultimately, God did use his circumstances to exalt him and make him literally the second leader of Egypt. He went from lowest of the low, prisoner, right, to being right beneath Pharaoh. God can work miracles, guys, right? And when we wait on him and when we give him the stress, right, and we choose to let go of the stress and focus on his peace and have that peace in us, he will guide us. Because that's the thing, I think most of the time we get these anxieties and these worries and these stresses, not just because, something's going wrong, you lost a job unexpectedly, right? Or a relationship you thought was going to work out didn't work out, or, something you were hoping was going to happen that maybe God has promised you just hasn't happened yet, right? We have all of these trials and all of these worries and all of these stresses on a day-to-day basis, and it's up to us, of course, what we do with those, right? We can choose to be worried about them. We can choose to stress. We can choose to get severe anxiety over certain things, or we can even choose to try and forge our own path and be okay, God, well, obviously you don't have this, so I'm going to try and do it myself, right? And we can choose to do all of these things, and yet none of these things really serve us very well, right? The best path, of course, is to immediately, when there is a stress, to take it to God, set it down at his feet, right? And be okay, God, this is what's happening. You know that this is what's happening, right? I'm feeling this sort of way about this thing. I need you to take this from me. I need your peace. I need you to give me that peace and guide me so I know what to do next, right? And when we give that trust to God, because it is an act of trust, right? Letting something go, whether it's stress about a family member, stress about a living situation, stress about a future scenario, whatever it might be, right? When we choose to let that go and give it to God, it's an act of trusting him and letting him be the one guiding our steps and be the one taking charge of where we're going next, right? And God is so faithful. He will guide us, right? If you honestly seek him and ask him, be hey, this is stressing me out. What do you want me to do in this scenario, right? He'll tell you. Might take a little while for you to listen, right? Or to be fully open to whatever idea it is he's asking of you. or whatever it is he's suggesting, right? But he will guide you. And sometimes that guidance is him telling you something specific to do, right? So like if you're in between jobs, right? He might tell you to apply for a specific job at a specific place, right? He might do that. He also could tell you to sit and wait. And sometimes I find that the waiting is almost harder than the when he actually tells you to do something, right? Because the waiting is like a whole nother level of trust and having peace that he's going to come through. I've done that multiple times where he's like, I want you to wait. Sometimes he's done it where he's like, I want you to apply somewhere or do something, right? And then sometimes he's like, I want you to just wait and trust me, right? And in that waiting, it might look crazy to the world, right? That you have peace, that you're waiting on God to do something as opposed to just going out and doing it yourself, because the whole world tells you that if something's not working or if something, isn't going your way, to just go out and fix it yourself. Like, that's your job. Go fix it. Go do it. Do something about it to make it better, right? But sometimes God wants us to just wait on him because he has better circumstances in mind. He has something in mind that only he can accomplish, right? So like when Joseph ended up a slave, right? And then ended up in prison, he had to wait on God. And God used his circumstances of being in prison to end up getting him exactly where he needed to go, to where he was end up being like the second ruler in Egypt, and then basically saved the entire people from a 7-year-long famine, right? Like, if it wasn't for God having him in these circumstances to begin with, and if it wasn't for him waiting on God, say if he tried to escape the jail on his own, or he decided to be a runaway slave, right? If he had decided to do something that was counter to what God wanted, if he decided to take things into his own hands, he could have ended up not getting to where he needed to go and wouldn't have saved his family from starvation, right? Not to mention everybody else in the country at the time. Like, if we wait on him, he brings things together in a way that we never could. Honestly, in a way that doesn't even make sense to our puny little minds, in a way that it comes together beautifully and perfectly, and it's full of peace, and so it's from him, right? It's a beautiful thing when that happens. In order for it to happen, though, right, we have to trust him. We have to take his inner peace, right, and use it and utilize it. Not just, have it there as an option, but decide to worry and stress and do all this other stuff instead. Like, we actually have to want to receive it, because he's not going to force his peace on us, right? We have free will. He's not going to force his plan on us. He's not going to force us to wait for him. He's not going to force us to do what he wants, because we have free will. That's the beautiful gift he gave us, is free will, right? So God might ask you to wait for, let's say, marriage, right? Just as an example, okay? You might desire marriage, right? And God might have said, I specifically want you to wait. And he might have told you to wait for a specific circumstance. He might tell you to wait for a specific person. He might tell you just to wait, period, until he's ready, right? And that waiting might take longer than you anticipated, right? That waiting might look different than you thought it would. Like, if you're waiting for a specific thing for God to do, you're like, okay, God, is it going to happen? How about now? How about now? As we wait, it can be rough, and it can take a long time too. Like, how long it took Abraham and Sarah before they got their promise of having a child that God had given them, right? They had to wait something like 20 years. Joseph, from the time he was sold into slavery until he saw his brothers again, was something like over 20 years, right? Waiting on God, it doesn't always happen immediately. Sometimes he can have it do that, right? But sometimes waiting on him is a level of patience and a level of faith that will really stretch you and make you a little antsy. It might make you a little uncomfortable. Like if he's having you wait for a job or something, right? Or he's having you wait for a specific scenario to do with your finances, right? And you're watching the numbers, as money keeps going out and there's not much coming in, right? Like it can make you antsy. It can tempt you to want to do things on your own. It can tempt you to put God's plan aside and just try and make something happen because you're worried that it's not going to happen, right? God uses these periods of waiting and this needing to seek out his peace, right? He gives us these periods of waiting or these periods of adversity, things that happen in our lives, circumstances, that could be designed by him or honestly could just be attacks from the enemy. But he will use them to stretch us. He'll use them to make us want to seek him out, to want to go for his peace because, dealing with stress and worry and anxiety and all of that is just so difficult, right? Especially if there's a lot of circumstances that happen to pile on one right after the other that are not so great, right? As life does, right? Sometimes it's like, oh, just one thing happens that you consider to be a bad thing. And then other times it feels like you just can't catch a break, right? Like this happens and then that happens and then that happens and then this breaks down and then that turns around the wrong way and that happens and you're like, what is going on, right? God uses these circumstances to have us trust him more, to have us look for that peace in him. Because we can keep turning to the worldly peace even after being Christians, should we choose to do so. Again, free will. We can choose to have worldly peace by distracting ourselves with entertainment or, social media, this or that, right? We can seek out worldly peace by trying to go meditate or go to a retreat or try to empty your mind or all these other things that the world says is something you should be doing or something that supposedly helps, right? Or we can choose to let God intervene, to give him our faith and our trust, and to take his peace on. And I will say, having done both of these options, right? I've gone the worldly peace option before in my own life. I've also gone the godly peace option way. And this way is so much better. Like, the peace you get over here, right, in God's way, is a million times more potent and just so much better than worldly peace that lasts for a very short amount of time and isn't super satisfying, right? Like, the worldly peace is like taking a breath, but godly peace erases the stress and the worries and the anxieties so long as you choose not to pick them back up and start carrying them again yourself. It's a beautiful thing. It looks crazy from the outside. It totally does. People might look at you like, well, why aren't you doing something? You want to get married, right? Why aren't you on a dating site? Why aren't you going out to all these events? Why aren't you, going to a bar and picking up some person, Or if it's a job thing, they'll be like, well, why don't you apply here? Why don't you apply there? Oh, I heard this job from this friend from over here. Why aren't you doing something with that? And then you say, well, I'm waiting on God, right? And they look at you like, what? But honestly, when you wait on him and when he pulls through for you, when you have that peace in the waiting, the peace in the adversity, and then the peace in the good times too. His peace transfers through all of the times and doesn't just skedaddle on you, right? His peace is there always. And you have this peace and he's guiding your path, he's leading the way. Whatever it might look like in the meantime doesn't really matter. That he's got it at the end of things, right? Even if it looks just weird or bad or, impossible in the meantime, right? Knowing that he has it and having this peace is the best kind of peace you could ever ask for, right? And it's the kind of peace that every single person can have if you choose to have it. It's not something that's only for like an exclusive group of people. This peace isn't like you have to buy your way in to get it, right? Honestly, this peace, if you choose to have God in your life, if you choose to trust him, right, you can have that inner peace. He'll give it to you. Like, you just have to want a relationship with him. And then it's free. Like, Jesus went to the cross and died so all of our sins and all of our issues could be forgiven, right? Like, he went and paid the price already, so our admittance is free, right? And you might say, well, then you can't sin anymore, if you go in, so technically there's a cost to it. But in reality, when you accept God and you start being with God, right, giving up those sins and letting them go doesn't necessarily seem like a price to pay. Like, as you get closer to God, he opens your eyes to how those sins hurt you, how those sins hurt the people around you, how lying, right, could hurt you, hurt your friends, hurt your family, or how cheating can, hurt all these people. He opens your eyes to the actual ramifications of the sins, and you get to the point where you don't want to do that anymore. It's not like he's prying it from your fingertips and making you get rid of it, right? As you choose to be with him, you don't feel those desires to want those things anymore, right? Because you know that doing those things hinders your relationship with God, and your relationship with God becomes your number one, right? So doing things that specifically will make it so you have a harder time communicating with him, or you have a harder time hearing from him, you're not going to want to do those things anymore. So it's not really like a price you're paying. It's something you willingly let go over time, if that makes sense. I hope it does. But that being said, honestly, I think in this world there are many adversities. There are tons of things and circumstances that happen that are outside of our control. Sometimes they're the consequences of our own actions. Sometimes they're just things that just happen, right? And all of these things can be stressful, can be anxiety-inducing, can be something that keeps you up at night if you let it, right? All of these things can be rough to go through. I'm not saying that any of these things are particularly easy to go through, but when we choose to give our worries to God, when we choose to accept his peace, going through them and walking through the circumstances that are not so great doesn't feel that bad. It's actually much better when you walk into these different things with peace. When you're overwhelmed with peace, right? Walking through the circumstances is not so bad. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, right? You can be in the valley of the shadow of death, right? For yourself, for somebody else, whatever the case may be. But you're not going to feel overwhelmed by it because you've got God and you've got his peace. I think that's about all I got to say on that today, guys. I hope you guys choose to have God's peace. I hope that this video was helpful in some way. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.